We'll now begin questioning, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Drummond, in my opening statement, I discussed how the EPA's risk management program's final rule exceeds statutory authority and goes beyond what I would consider to be reasonable and practical. Some would argue that the heavy mandates and the use of vague terms in the federal regulations issued by this administration, as well as their enforcement, are designed to create a punishing environment for disfavored industries rather than even-handedly enforcing our laws. Mr. Drummond, from what you've seen in Oklahoma, would you agree or disagree with this statement, and why?
I would certainly agree with your statement, Mr. Chairman. It's hard enough for a business in any industry to comply with the clearest and simplest of government mandates. And I know that industry leaders subject to the rule will want to comply, and they will do everything that they can to comply with the current rules. However, the rule as proposed is both vague and it's preventative in its terms, that we'll see that certain businesses and industries exposed to enforcement action, even though they have made every effort to comply. Another problem I would point out is the vagueness and that it's bound to increase costs. And those who wish to play by the rules inevitably will do more and spend more to comply. As I said previously, these costs ultimately will be passed on to consumers.
Good. I'm also concerned that these abuses of the statute are an attempt to co-opt RMP into a zero-risk program, something that was not created to be. Mr. Shah, in your opinion, is a zero-risk a feasible regulatory pursuit? Microphone.
Thank you, Congressman Carter. Achieving zero risk is not a practical option from a regulatory perspective or from any perspective, because the only way you get to zero risk is by not performing the activity.
Well, if we kind of expand upon that, can you explain the importance of consequence and probability in properly assessing risk?
Yeah, so let me use the example of crossing the street. We all cross streets, and the consequence of crossing a street is potentially getting hit by a vehicle and dying. The probability of that happening depends upon where we cross that street and what's happening on that street, right? So if I'm crossing a residential street and I cross in the middle of the street, I have a higher probability of getting hit than if I cross at a crosswalk at the corner. If I cross at a crosswalk that has a light that tells me when to cross that crosswalk, walk or do not walk, then my probability of getting hit drops even further. If I build a pedestrian bridge across that street to cross, my probability of getting hit by a car drops to zero. But my risk hasn't completely gone away, even with the pedestrian bridge. I've transferred that risk to something else, which is that pedestrian bridge could collapse, and the person driving underneath that bridge, if that collapses on them, they could die from that accident. So I've not eliminated risk to zero in that situation either.
And I have to agree with you, and I'm not trying to mix apples and oranges here, but I'm a pharmacist, and I was a consultant pharmacist in a nursing home, and one of the questions we always ask about medications was the benefit outweigh the risk, and often the benefit does outweigh the risk, so I couldn't agree with you more, and I appreciate that. We all know, Mr. Erstead, that RMP rules must be reasonable. And we all have a different definition of reasonable. I understand that. But in practice, do you think as a regulated entity, do you think the regulation is reasonable?
I mean, I think, from a business perspective, we look too at that cost-benefit analysis. And obviously, we want to be in compliance, and safety is critical. We definitely want that. But I think in light of these rules, we have a hard time seeing the benefit that comes from them. And there is certainly a cost associated with them, and I think it would be helpful if we understood the true benefit coming out of them.
Can you cite any in particular and to give us an example?
Well, I think that, I talked a little bit about this safer technological alternatives analysis that we have to go through that, we're already doing RegGap, we're already doing what we believe are industry standard practices, and that's what we want to do. We don't want to add, I think as Mr. Shah said, additional risks that are not otherwise anticipated.
Okay. Thank you all again for being here, and I'll now recognize the